On the evening of April 9th, 1995, the air in rural Tennessee carried that familiar warmth that settles in just before spring fully arrives. Most of the county had already begun shutting down for the night. Porch lights clicked on, screen doors slammed, and the long stretch of farmland that framed the two-lane road outside town faded into its usual quiet. It was the kind of night where nothing dramatic ever happened, and no one expected it to. And that was exactly why what happened to 15-year-old Brandy Moody shook the community's sense of safety to its core. Brandy had spent the late afternoon at her friend's house, just half a mile from home, close enough that she didn't need a ride, close enough that she had walked that same path more times than anyone could count. Friends described her as soft-spoken but bright, a girl who carried a quiet confidence. She wasn't the type to pick fights or draw attention. She was simply dependable, predictable. That made her disappearance all the more jarring. Around 6:15 p.m., she told her friend she should head home before her mother worried. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, stepped onto the gravel driveway, and started down the familiar road. No one knew those would be the last moments anyone would ever see her alive. When Brandy didn't walk through the front door by dinner, her mother, Patricia, felt a wave of unease that she couldn't quite explain. At first, she tried to reassure herself. Maybe Brandy stopped to chat with a neighbor. Maybe she lingered near the creek like she sometimes did. But minutes stretched into an hour, and that unease settled into something heavier. Patricia called a few of Brandy's friends, hoping someone had seen her, but every response deepened the worry. Brandy had left exactly when she said she did. The walk took 8, maybe 10 minutes. The road was empty, and now she was simply gone. By 8 p.m., fear outweighed patience. Patricia contacted the sheriff's office, her voice trembling as she reported her daughter missing. Deputies responded politely but skeptically. They'd heard this before. Teenagers wandered off. They stayed with friends. They tested boundaries. A girl going missing for a couple of hours wasn't enough to sound alarms. But Patricia insisted something was wrong, and there was something in her tone, some conviction that only a mother could express, that forced the deputies to listen. They agreed to check the road Brandy would have taken home. The first sweep covered the stretch between the friend's house and the Moody residence. The deputies walked slowly with flashlights, calling Brandy's name, waiting for any sign of movement. But the road stayed quiet. No rustling leaves, no frantic footsteps, no response. At 9:17 p.m., a deputy radioed in the first concerning detail. They found Brandy's backpack near a drainage culvert a few hundred yards from the friend's house. It wasn't torn. It wasn't hidden. It was simply lying there as if it had been placed, not dropped. That was the moment the search shifted from routine to urgent. Word spread quickly across the county. In a place where everybody knew everybody, news traveled faster than official reports. Within an hour, neighbors arrived with flashlights and dogs. Local farmers climbed into trucks to search their fields, and volunteer firefighters walked through the tangled edges of the woods. People kept asking the same question over and over. How does a 15-year-old vanish on a road she knew better than her own backyard? And why would her backpack be left behind unless someone else put it there? As midnight approached, tensions rose. Deputies fanned out across back roads, splitting into small teams to check abandoned barns, hunting stands, and creek beds. Locals joined in, spreading out into the dark fields with a grim determination. The only sounds were distant dogs barking and boots pushing through brush. The more they searched, the stranger the silence felt. There were no footprints suggesting a struggle, no tire tracks indicating a car had pulled off suddenly, no clothing scraps or signs of a chase. It was as if the road simply erased her. Around 2 a.m., a farmer reported seeing a truck earlier that evening driving slowly along the same road Brandy took. He didn't recognize it. which was unusual for this area, but he hadn't paid much attention. People came through sometimes, travelers, hunters, delivery drivers. Now he wondered if he should have taken note. Deputies logged the tip, but without a license plate or description beyond older model, dark color, there wasn't much they could do. Still, it became one of the first threads investigators would later pull. In the early morning hours, the sheriff officially launched a missing person investigation. By sunrise, more volunteers joined. A group searched an abandoned silo. Another walked along the creek. A third combed through the woods, behind a church, where teenagers sometimes gathered. But nothing pointed toward where Brandy went or who she was with. The only piece of physical evidence remained that single backpack left near the culvert. By noon, theories started spreading through town like wildfire. Some claimed they heard a scream earlier in the evening. Others insisted they saw headlights parked along the roadside. A few whispered about a man who lived in an isolated cabin near the woods, a man people avoided because he kept to himself and made others uneasy. Meanwhile, deputies struggled to separate rumor from reality. Every conversation seemed to offer another story, another suspicion, another name. There was too much noise and not enough truth. Inside the Moody home, Patricia refused to sleep. She sat at the kitchen table gripping Brandy's school photo as relatives came and went, offering food she didn't touch and words she barely heard. The sheriff stopped by to update her, though there wasn't much to say. Searches were ongoing. Nothing new had been found. They were doing everything they could. Patricia listened quietly, but her eyes said what she couldn't verbalize. If something wasn't found soon, Brandy might never be found at all. That evening, the community gathered at the local church to organize continued search efforts. Some people tried to stay optimistic. Others feared the worst. No one could reconcile how a girl could vanish within a half-mile radius of houses, farms, and family-owned shops. The sense of safety that once defined the rural county had evaporated in less than 24 hours. Deputies intensified their search near the culvert, believing the placement of the backpack meant something deliberate. One investigator believed Brandy may have been forced into a vehicle. Another suspected she had willingly approached someone she knew. But without evidence, these were guesses layered on top of guesses. The case already showed signs of the fractures that would later widen: miscommunication, assumptions, and the quiet pressure of a community demanding answers the sheriff's department didn't yet have. In the following days, search teams stretched their boundaries farther. They explored abandoned tobacco barns, climbed into empty silos, and checked drainage wells. They followed every narrow path cut through the woods and scanned the edges of ponds where the water sat unmoving. They found wildlife tracks, beer cans, fishing lures, and traces of old campfires. But none belonged to Brandy. The silence became suffocating. It was the kind of silence that suggests someone managed to make a person disappear without leaving behind a single hint of how they did it. By the end of the week, frustration began to surface. Some locals criticized the sheriff's department for not issuing an immediate alert. Others believed deputies should have treated the backpack as a sign of foul play from the beginning. But no matter who was blamed, the result was the same. Brandy was still missing, and the first crucial hours had slipped away while authorities debated whether a teenager simply wandered off. Despite the growing divide between the community and law enforcement, everyone shared one emotion: fear. Parents no longer allowed their kids to walk alone. Teenagers stayed indoors. Neighbors watched strangers with suspicion. A quiet dread took hold of the town, the kind that makes people check their locks twice and keep porch lights burning long after midnight. Through all of this, Brandy's last moments remained the one unanswered mystery no one could escape. She had walked down a road she trusted, heading toward a home she loved. Somewhere along that short stretch, someone, or something, interrupted her path, and whoever did it left almost no trace behind. The only remaining witness to her disappearance was the road itself, and it wasn't telling anyone anything. As the search entered its second week with no breakthroughs, people began to wonder if the truth was buried somewhere they hadn't thought to look yet. A detail overlooked, a person they hadn't questioned, a place that hadn't been searched. Something was missing, and the eerie stillness surrounding Brandy's last known steps felt like a secret hiding in plain sight. And in that stillness, the first cracks of a long-term mystery began to form. Cracks that would eventually pull this rural Tennessee community into one of the most haunting cold cases it had ever seen. In the days that followed Brandy Moody's disappearance, the quiet rhythm of rural Tennessee collapsed into something tense and unfamiliar. People who once waved at each other from passing trucks now kept their eyes forward. Parents who once trusted the safety of their dirt roads no longer let their children leave the yard. Every sunrise seemed to remind the county that another night had passed without answers, and another day would pass without knowing where a 15-year-old girl had gone. The sheriff's department tried to maintain control, but the weight of the case pressed harder with every hour that Brandy remained missing. Deputies began working through a list of everyone who had seen her in the weeks before. She vanished. They interviewed classmates who struggled to say anything more helpful than small observations. Some remembered she had seemed quieter lately. Others insisted she had acted completely normal. A few mentioned she had argued with someone on the phone, though none of them knew who it was. But teenagers remembered details inconsistently, and investigators quickly realized they were collecting fragments that didn't form any coherent picture. Neighbors were next. Deputies went door to door, knocking on houses scattered miles apart, asking the same questions again and again. Did anyone see Brandy on the road? Did they hear a car stop? Did they notice anyone unfamiliar hanging around? Most claimed they saw nothing. A few insisted they saw headlights near the stretch of road around the time she disappeared, but no one could provide a description. One woman said she heard what she thought was the sound of gravel being kicked up by tires. Another said she heard a girl scream, though she admitted she couldn't be certain it wasn't a fox or some other animal. Each statement blurred against the next, leaving deputies unsure which clues were real and which were desperate attempts to be helpful. They questioned farmers who worked the land behind the culvert where her backpack was found. Those fields stretched for acres, filled with deep ruts, windbreaks, and old fence lines where someone could hide without being seen. Several farmers searched their property voluntarily, combing through brush piles and remote sheds, but nothing from those searches pointed to Brandy. It was as if the land had swallowed any trace of her. As pressure mounted, the sheriff's department also revisited men with previous accusations involving harassment or disappearances. Some had been questioned in past cases that never led to arrests. Others had reputations the county whispered about, but never confronted openly. These men were interviewed again, their alibis checked and rechecked. A local drifter who lived out of his truck was questioned for nearly 6 hours before being released when his timeline was confirmed. A man with a history of stalking was interviewed twice, his house searched, and his tools tested for any trace of blood or fibers. Everything came back clean. Each suspect raised hopes that the investigation was turning a corner, and each release crushed those hopes just as quickly. Meanwhile, deputies continued running grid searches that stretched farther each day. They mapped the county into squares, walking one section at a time, clearing it before moving to the next. They searched beneath porches, behind abandoned sheds, inside drainage pipes, and under thick canopies of trees where sunlight barely reached the ground. Some sections were searched 2 or 3 times, as if investigators believed they might have overlooked something the first time. But even with the most methodical efforts, nothing surfaced. Not a piece of clothing, not a footprint, not even a broken twig that could be confidently attributed to Brandy. It was rare for a missing person case to leave so little behind, and that lack of physical evidence began to disturb even the most experienced deputies. The absence of answers created a vacuum, and the vacuum filled with speculation. Gossip spread faster than any official news. In diners, churches, and feed stores, people talked about a truck that someone claimed to see near the creek the night Brandy vanished. Some said it was dark blue. Others insisted it was black. Some swore it was an older model Ford. Others argued it had been a Dodge. The sheriff's department received so many conflicting reports that they eventually logged the vehicle as unconfirmed. Though, the rumor continued gaining traction in town as if it were fact. Another rumor focused on a man who lived deep in the woods in a small, deteriorating cabin. He rarely came into town. He hunted for most of his food and kept mostly to himself. Locals described him as strange, but no one ever reported him for anything. People just avoided him. When Brandy disappeared, that avoidance transformed into suspicion overnight. Within days, deputies searched his property. They walked through his shed, checked his tools, and questioned him thoroughly. He cooperated calmly, provided an alibi, and allowed investigators to inspect everything he owned. Nothing tied him to Brandy. But rumors are stubborn. Even after he was cleared, many people continued to view him as the man who felt wrong, which was enough to keep his name circulating in whispered conversations. As the rumor mill expanded, new theories emerged, each one more complicated than the last. Some people speculated Brandy had been unintentionally caught in the middle of a quiet feud between two families with a bad history. No one could explain why she would be targeted, but the county had a long memory when it came to grudges. Others said she had been seen talking to an older boy days earlier and wondered if she had run off with him. Investigators looked into that claim, too. They questioned the boy, checked his whereabouts, and verified he'd been at work the night she disappeared. Once again, a theory that had sparked excitement led nowhere. For deputies, the gossip became a constant distraction. Every rumor had to be investigated, no matter how implausible, because ignoring one could mean missing the truth. But every new detour pulled resources away from the shrinking pool of legitimate leads. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation began to feel like a machine running in place, working hard, burning energy, but going nowhere. Inside the sheriff's office, frustration mounted. Officers were exhausted. Volunteers were worn thin. Even seasoned investigators struggled to hide their concern. They had reached a point where the only consistent pattern in the case was the absence of one. Every lead evaporated. Every theory unraveled. Every search ended with empty hands. There were no fibers, no footprints, no tire impressions, no signs of a struggle. If someone had taken Brandy, they managed to do it without leaving behind the typical trail abductions often produced. That fact alone made the county feel as though the person responsible wasn't just dangerous, they were careful. For the Moody family, the days became unbearable. Patricia's hope flickered between strength and collapse. One moment, she was convinced Brandy was still alive and waiting to be found. The next, she was overwhelmed by the silence that followed every phone call from the sheriff's department. Brandy's siblings struggled to understand why their sister hadn't come home yet. Relatives tried to stay positive, but optimism became harder to maintain as the calendar advanced with no progress. The cafeteria at the local high school turned into a meeting space where volunteers gathered daily to plan new search routes. Maps covered the tables. Highlighters marked completed areas. People who had never spoken to each other before now worked side by side, bound by a shared urgency. But even the most determined volunteers couldn't shake the fear that someone in their own community, the person who bought groceries at the same store, who fueled their truck at the same gas station, might be responsible. That fear began shaping the town. Shop owners installed new locks. Families kept porch lights on until dawn. Women who once walked alone at dusk now traveled in pairs. Even simple routines felt different. Suspicion replaced familiarity. Distrust replaced comfort. The sheriff knew the public wanted answers, but he was running out of places to look. Meetings with state investigators provided moral support, but few actionable suggestions. Specialists reviewed the case file looking for angles that might have been overlooked, but they kept arriving at the same conclusion. There was simply no evidence pointing investigators in any direction. Every attempt to calm the community only intensified the pressure. A growing number of people believed the sheriff's office had mishandled the early hours of the case. They questioned why an alert wasn't issued sooner and why the backpack hadn't triggered a larger, more immediate response. But pointing fingers didn't bring anyone closer to finding Brandy. As week 3 approached, even the detectives began acknowledging privately that they were running out of time. Cases like this tended to follow a pattern. The first 48 hours were critical. The first week was hopeful. But by the third week, if nothing emerged, it often meant the truth was hidden somewhere far more complicated than anyone wanted to believe. The county entered a quiet panic. Conversations in grocery lines became hushed. People who once felt safe letting their kids play by the creek no longer trusted the woods. And at the center of it all, the Moody family watched as the investigation that had once felt urgent now seemed like it was unraveling. Leads had dried up. Rumors had taken over. And the one person who could explain what happened, Brandy herself, was nowhere to be found. As the sun set over another week without answers, a cold realization settled across the community. Someone had managed to take a 15-year-old girl off a familiar road in broad daylight, carry out whatever happened next, and do it so cleanly that not a single thread of evidence remained. And that terrifying possibility left the county with one haunting question. If the person responsible was living among them, how long would they stay hidden before they struck again? By the spring of 1996, almost a full year after Brandy Moody vanished, the energy that once surrounded the investigation had thinned into something distant and muted. What began with helicopters circling above fields and hundreds of volunteers combing the woods had slowly faded into a trickle of routine tasks, paperwork updates, occasional follow-ups, and the quiet acknowledgement that nothing new had surfaced. Her case file, once thick with active reports and handwritten notes, now gathered dust on the corner of a shelf reserved for cases without direction. No one ever said it aloud, but everyone in the sheriff's office understood what it meant when a file reached that corner. It meant the investigation had frozen in place. Detectives who had once pushed daily for progress began retiring or transferring to other departments. They carried their regrets with them, quietly admitting that Brandy's disappearance had become one of the cases that haunted them the most. They remembered the early urgency, the long nights of searching, the constant hope that one more interview, one more search, one more tip would finally break the case open. But those moments were now memories fading into the same silence that had swallowed Brandy's trail. Before long, only a few officers who worked the original investigation remained, and even they found themselves reciting the same summary every time a new supervisor asked for an update. No evidence, no suspects, no direction. As investigators stepped away, so did the witnesses. Some moved out of the county for work, others grew older and forgot details they once repeated confidently. A few passed away. Each departure chipped away at the fragile structure of the case. Memories that had once seemed sharp now blurred, and statements that once carried weight became nothing more than vague impressions. It was as though the story of Brandy's last moments had been left out in the weather too long, exposed until it faded into something nearly unreadable. But while officials gradually shifted their attention to newer cases, Brandy's mother, Patricia, refused to let her daughter's story be buried by time. Every April, she organized a prayer vigil near the church at the center of town. People gathered with candles, photographs, and handwritten messages. Some came to support Patricia. Others came because they never quite shook the feeling that something terrible had happened close to their homes. Each year, Patricia stood before the crowd and reminded them that her daughter was still missing, still loved, and still needed to be found. She begged local authorities not to forget Brandy, not to allow her disappearance to become just another file at the back of a drawer. Those vigils became a quiet part of the county's yearly rhythm. They served as a reminder that even though the search parties had stopped and the interviews had ended, the wound the town felt had never fully closed. Parents who once held their children close during the early weeks of fear now brought those children, older, taller, to stand beside them in silence. Time had passed, but no one could claim it had healed much. A decade crawled forward. Seasons changed. Roads aged. New families moved into old houses, and a generation of kids grew up only hearing Brandy's name in hushed tones. The sheriff's department modernized. Old paper records were scanned into digital files. New officers who hadn't been around in 1995 joined the force and occasionally reviewed the case out of curiosity, but each time they reached the same frustrating conclusion. The file contained nothing to build on. No DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness confirmations, no recovered possessions beyond the backpack. The investigation had been thorough, but the evidence simply wasn't there. As technology advanced, a few hopeful opportunities emerged. By the early 2000s, DNA indexing had expanded across the country. States began sharing information more seamlessly. Cold case detectives in other regions made breakthroughs by comparing old evidence to newly digitized offender databases. Families of missing persons received calls that had been years overdue. Patricia waited for hers, believing that if other families received answers, maybe she eventually would too. The sheriff's office submitted every available item from Brandy's case for analysis again. Her backpack, the clothing found inside, even the straps and zippers. This time, advanced testing looked for microscopic traces that the labs in 1995 wouldn't have been able to detect. But when the results came back, the disappointment was crushing. Nothing matched anyone in the National Offender System. No unknown DNA profiles were found. No fingerprints had been preserved well enough to analyze. It was as if the items had never been touched by another person at all. The renewed technological hope quickly dissolved. Officials apologized, telling Patricia they had done everything they could with what they had. They encouraged her to keep faith, assuring her that advancements continued every year and that one day something might emerge. She nodded politely, but everyone in the room saw the weight behind her eyes. Hope was harder to hold after so many years of empty tests and dead leads. As more time passed, the silence surrounding Brandy's case became its own kind of presence. Heavy, unyielding, and deeply unsettling. People stopped speculating openly, but the fear remained. The unanswered questions lingered. Had someone taken her and vanished from the county? Had she been harmed by someone she knew? Or had she been taken by a person who still lived among them? No one had answers, but everyone carried a quiet uneasiness whenever the subject resurfaced. Every now and then, a tip would come through. Someone claimed they saw a girl who looked like Brandy in another state, or someone insisted they overheard a confession in a bar. Deputies followed each lead, even the ones they knew were unlikely. They drove across counties, checked records, interviewed strangers, and traced rumors. Each time, they returned empty-handed. False hope became part of the cycle, adding to the emotional exhaustion that had long consumed the Moody family. By 2005, most of the people directly involved in Brandy's early investigation had accepted that the case had moved beyond their ability to solve. New detectives inherited the file, but without new evidence, It remained one of those haunting mysteries that law enforcement quietly carried, unsolved, unforgotten, but unreachable. Meanwhile, Patricia kept every newspaper clipping, every candle from every vigil, and every prayer uttered in Brandy's name. She refused to let time rewrite her daughter's story into something small or insignificant. She believed deeply that someone knew what had happened, even if they had never spoken. She believed that memory had a way of cracking under guilt, and that someday someone would reveal what they had kept hidden. Yet for all her faith, the truth remained buried. Whether it was buried in the mind of a witness who had been too afraid to come forward, buried in the conscience of someone who had managed to hide a terrible secret, or buried in some overlooked piece of information sitting quietly in the case file, no one could say. All that was certain was that time had become the investigation's most damaging enemy. The county moved forward, but the case never truly left the background. It lingered at the edge of conversations during family reunions, resurfaced when new missing person stories appeared on the news, and returned every April during the vigil that Patricia refused to abandon. The silence surrounding Brandy's disappearance became part of the community's identity, a cold reminder that even small, close-knit places could harbor darkness. But beneath that stillness, beneath years of unanswered questions and quiet grief, something important had been missed, something small, something overlooked. And though no one knew it yet, a single object hidden away for more than a decade would eventually re-enter the story and shake the entire investigation open again. What had once seemed like a case frozen forever was about to receive the one thing it had never had: Brandy's own voice. In the spring of 2011, 16 years after Brandy Moody vanished from a quiet Tennessee road, her case had all but slipped into the realm of unsolved tragedies people whispered about, but rarely expected an update on. The sheriff's office still kept the file, still answered the occasional question from reporters, still took the yearly call from Patricia Moody, who refused to let her daughter's name disappear. But in reality, the case had settled into the same stillness that surrounds most cold cases. Nothing new came in. No one new came forward. The road where she vanished looked exactly the same, and the silence that followed her disappearance felt just as heavy. No one could have predicted that the first real movement in the case would begin inside a dilapidated trailer on the outskirts of the county, a place most people didn't even remember anymore. The property had been abandoned for years, its owner long gone, its future uncertain. When the bank finally foreclosed and scheduled a cleanup crew to prepare it for auction, the workers expected to find the usual debris: old magazines, broken furniture, forgotten clothes. What they didn't expect was a discovery that would undo 16 years of assumptions in a single afternoon. While pulling up frayed carpet in the back bedroom, one of the workers noticed something wedged tightly between the deteriorating padding and the wooden floor. At first, he thought it was trash, an old notebook swollen from age. But when he pulled it free, he realized it had been intentionally hidden. The object was a small, worn diary covered in a faded floral pattern. The edges curled from moisture, the spine cracked from years of pressure. It looked like it had been pressed beneath the carpet for more than a decade, untouched and unseen. The worker handed it to his supervisor, who noticed the dates written inside the front cover: 1994, 1997. The handwriting was young, uneven, the kind belonging to a teenage girl. The supervisor flipped to the first few pages, expecting teenage musings about friendships or school, but the contents were nothing like that. The entries described fear, watching, being followed. A girl writing about seeing the same older man near her bus stop, near the store, near the stretch of road she walked more than any other. The entries became increasingly distressed, increasingly detailed, as if she believed writing was the only place she could safely say what she couldn't tell anyone else. The supervisor didn't know whose diary it was, but something about the tone felt urgent, wrong, and deeply personal. And when he saw the final date of the entries, April 9th, 1995, the same day Brandy Moody disappeared, he froze. The diary was quickly turned over to law enforcement. When deputies learned where it had been found, the discovery became far more alarming. The trailer had once been owned by a man who was questioned in the early days of Brandy's disappearance, a man who lived alone, who had no firm alibi, who had been interviewed but ultimately released because nothing tied him to the case. His name had surfaced in rumors, in vague suspicions, in the worried conversations of parents in 1995. But without evidence, the sheriff's department had been forced to move on. Now, after 16 years, a teenage girl's diary had surfaced from beneath the floor of his bedroom. Detectives approached the diary cautiously, aware that the contents could finally unlock a case that had tormented the county for more than a decade. They sent it to analysts who examined the handwriting, compared slang and phrasing to Brandy's known school assignments, and reviewed references inside the entries, references to teachers, friends, specific roads, and locations within the county. Everything aligned. There was no doubt. The diary belonged to Brandy Moody. And once investigators confirmed that fact, the weight of what they were reading deepened. The diary began innocently enough: school frustrations, family moments, small entries about crushes and homework. But by late 1994, the tone shifted. Brandy wrote about seeing an older man repeatedly near the creek, sometimes sitting in a truck she didn't recognize. She wrote about the feeling of being watched, about noticing the same figure near the church, the same pair of boots behind her when she walked home, and how she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed intentionally. She never named him. She only described him: older, quiet, always, alone, always appearing where he didn't belong. In early 1995, the entries became more frightened. She mentioned hearing footsteps behind her on nights when the road should have been empty. She wrote about finding small disturbances near the culvert. Objects moved, fresh tire impressions, cigarette butts where no one smoked. Then the entries became coded. Brandy sketched simple road maps of the county, marking places where she believed she saw him. The drawings were crude, but unmistakably tied to the area where she would later disappear. One of the most unsettling pages came from March 1995. Brandy wrote that she believed the man had started following her more boldly. She wrote about hearing her window rattle one night, about seeing him watching her from a distance near school, about thinking she recognized his truck, but not being certain enough to tell anyone. Investigators reading the diary realized she had been living in fear for months, afraid to confront the truth, but unable to ignore it. And then they reached the last entry, written the very afternoon she disappeared. Brandy wrote that she was planning to meet someone who promised answers. She didn't specify who, she didn't say where. But she wrote that she hoped the meeting would finally make the fear stop. That final line lingered like a shadow across the page. Detectives studying the diary felt a mix of guilt and disbelief. They had interviewed the former suspect who lived in the trailer. They had walked through his home, talked to him, cleared him. They had never lifted the carpet. They had never searched deep enough to find something that had been hiding inches from their boots. The realization hit hard. If the diary had been discovered in 1995, the entire investigation might have unfolded differently. The discovery triggered an immediate reopening of the case. The sheriff contacted state investigators. Cold case specialists were brought in to examine the new evidence. Prosecutors reviewed the diary's contents with increasing concern. The timeline Brandy referenced aligned with the weeks and months leading to her disappearance. The locations she marked aligned with witness rumors and the place her backpack had been found. And the descriptions she wrote matched the physical appearance of the former suspect almost perfectly. It wasn't proof of his guilt, but it was the most significant lead the case had gained in 16 years. Investigators also realized something else. The diary's dates extended beyond April 1995, stretching into late 1997. But the final entries weren't written by Brandy. They were blank, empty, possibly unused. But the very fact that the diary remained in the suspect's home long after her disappearance raised questions no one could ignore. Why did he have Brandy's diary? Why had he hidden it under his carpet? And why had he kept it? As investigators pieced through the new evidence, the emotional weight of the discovery settled over them. They wondered how many clues had been buried under the routine chaos of the early investigation. How many chances they had missed. How much Brandy had tried to say before she vanished. The diary didn't solve the case, but it reshaped it. It provided glimpses of motive, of stalking patterns, of fear Brandy had carried alone. It offered a timeline that law enforcement had never seen before, and it pointed directly back to a man they had once questioned, then dismissed. 16 years after Brandy Moody vanished, her voice, written in the shaky hand of a scared teenage girl, rose from beneath the floorboards of a forgotten trailer, and law enforcement knew, with absolute certainty now, that they had overlooked something critical in 1995, something that might finally lead them to the person who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The discovery of Brandy Moody's diary breathed life into a case that had been silent for 16 years. And as investigators traced its origins back to the trailer where it had been hidden, they were forced to confront a name they had once crossed off their list. A man who had lived in that trailer alone, who had been questioned briefly in 1995, and who had slipped through the cracks because the evidence simply wasn't there. Now, the possibility that he had kept Brandy's own words under his floorboards changed everything. The man was a local mechanic named Rayburn Hale. He'd lived in the county his entire life. People knew him, but not well. They brought their trucks to him when they stalled or overheated. They nodded to him at the gas station, and then they kept their distance. He wasn't friendly, but he wasn't openly hostile either. He lingered somewhere in that uncomfortable space between familiar and unknown. Enough for people to tolerate him. Enough for no one to truly trust him. Back in 1995, he had been interviewed because he lived close to the area where Brandy disappeared. Deputies noted he seemed nervous, but they also noted that he had been cooperative. He let them search his truck. He answered their questions without hesitation. And without evidence to hold him, the sheriff's department released him. His name never fully left the rumor mill, but it left the investigation. Now investigators had to revisit every detail about him. His employment records showed he had worked alone most days. Police reports, long forgotten, revealed he had been accused of harassing 2 women in the early 1990s. Neither case resulted in charges. Both women eventually withdrew their complaints, each saying they didn't want trouble. The pattern wasn't enough to prove anything on its own, but it painted the beginning of a picture investigators had never seen clearly before. With the diary in their possession, detectives executed a new search warrant on the trailer. The structure had deteriorated significantly since Hale moved out, but the floorboards were still intact. This time, forensic specialists examined every inch using technology that did not exist in 1995. High-resolution fiber analysis, chemical luminol treatments, micro-vacuuming, procedures that could detect what simple visual inspections never would. And lodged deep beneath the floorboards, embedded in the wood grain, they found fibers. The initial report indicated they were consistent with clothing from the mid-1990s. When compared to fibers from Brandy's backpack and clothing her family had preserved, the match was undeniable. They were hers. They had been in his trailer all along. The revelation hit investigators hard. It meant she had been inside that trailer. It meant the person who lived there had lied. It meant the early assumptions in 1995, the belief that they had no cause to pursue him, had been disastrously wrong. As news of the reopened investigation spread through the county, people who had stayed silent for years finally began to speak. One man admitted he had seen Rayburn Hale parked near the culvert the night Brandy disappeared. He hadn't reported it then because Hale had a reputation for reacting violently when confronted. Another witness, a woman who lived near the friend's house, recalled seeing Hale's truck creeping down the road earlier that afternoon. At the time, she dismissed it as coincidence. Now she regretted that silence. Each witness carried the same thread of fear. Fear of retaliation. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being dragged into something they wanted to pretend wasn't happening. But with the diary now public knowledge, the fear that had kept them quiet was finally overshadowed by the guilt of having withheld what they had seen. Investigators worked late into the night, reconstructing every detail of Brandy's last weeks based on her entries. Her coded sketches marked locations that formed a loose circle around Hale's usual driving routes. Her descriptions of an older man watching her aligned with the age, appearance, and work schedule of Hale. Her final entry, meeting someone who promised answers, looked less like a hope-filled line and more like the words of a girl manipulated into trusting the person she feared. Detectives began building a psychological profile of Hale using old complaints, interview transcripts, employment records, and statements from people who had known him. He was solitary but observant, someone who watched others more than he interacted with them. He targeted younger girls or women who seemed quiet or unsure of themselves. He avoided confrontations he couldn't control, but once he gained someone's trust, he found ways to keep them isolated. The emerging pattern matched exactly what the diary had hinted all along. Brandy had been groomed, slowly, subtly, carefully. Hale had likely begun, following her months before she realized it. He watched her routine, learned when she walked alone, anticipated her movements. He presented himself as someone who had answers, someone who could help her. And on the day she disappeared, she believed him. Investigators studied the timeline and reached a chilling conclusion. Hale had likely chosen the moment she left her friend's house because he knew she would be alone. He knew the distance was short enough for her guard to be down. He knew the road was quiet enough for no one to see. What they didn't yet know was whether Brandy had willingly approached his vehicle or whether he had forced her inside. Her diary suggested she trusted him just enough to let her fear override her instincts. That single possibility weighed heavily on detectives, imagining the moment she realized she was in danger, the moment she realized she had trusted the wrong person. Land maps from 1995 were spread across an entire conference room table. Detectives used push pins and string to map the locations Brandy mentioned, the places witnesses last saw Hale's truck, and the routes connecting them. The result formed a chilling network of paths that all intersected around the same area, his trailer. The more they uncovered, the more obvious it became that Hale had operated carefully, intentionally, and quietly. He knew the land. He knew which roads were rarely traveled. He knew how to isolate someone without drawing attention. And he had managed to hide any trace of Brandy for 16 years without anyone noticing. The case was no longer a mystery built on speculation. It was shaping into a narrative grounded in evidence, witness testimony, behavioral patterns, and forensic proof. Every finding tightened the circle around Hale, leaving less and less room for doubt. Detectives drafted their arrest warrant with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They knew confronting him would be dangerous. They knew he might deny everything. They knew he might refuse to speak at all. But what they feared most was the possibility that he had kept more secrets than the diary and the fibers revealed. Secrets about where Brandy had gone after she was taken into that trailer. Secrets about whether she had suffered. secrets about whether her remains were somewhere on land he once had access to. As they prepared to approach him, one question lingered like an unanswered echo. After 16 years of silence, would Rayburn Hale finally reveal what he had done? Or would the truth remain buried somewhere only he knew? And with that uncertainty heavy in the room, investigators took their next step, unsure whether they were about to uncover a confession or walk into a deeper mystery that still refused to fully come into the light. When detectives finally approached Rayburn Hale with the warrant, they expected resistance. They expected denial, rage, panic, anything to signal guilt. But the man who opened the door looked strangely calm, almost resigned, as if he had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone realized. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. He simply watched the officers enter his home with an expression that felt unnervingly steady. For a man accused of hiding a teenage girl's diary under his floorboards for more than a decade, his silence was its own confession. At the sheriff's office, investigators laid everything out in front of him. They showed him the diary, its worn floral cover, its damaged spine, the pages filled with Brandy's careful handwriting. They showed him the forensic reports confirming her fibers had been found beneath the floorboards of his old trailer. They recited the witness statements from people who had finally stepped forward after 16 years of fear. And they told him they knew the truth was no longer something he could hide behind silence. For a long moment, Hale said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the ceiling, breathing slowly, as if each breath cost him something. When he finally spoke, his voice was disturbingly even. He didn't deny knowing Brandy. He didn't deny seeing her on the road that afternoon. Instead, he began talking about her as if he had been rehearsing the words for years. How she was quiet, how she walked alone, how she seemed like someone who needed guidance. He said he never meant for things to end the way they did. He said he thought he could help her. Detectives listened, their faces tight, knowing that beneath his controlled tone lay the truth they had sought for nearly 2 decades. Hale admitted he had approached Brandy the day she disappeared. He told her he knew she'd been afraid of someone following her and claimed he had information that could help. The lie was simple enough to sound believable, especially to a scared 15-year-old desperate for answers. She walked closer. She asked him what he knew, and at that moment, he realized he had gained her trust, just enough to isolate her. What happened next was quick, confusing, and violent. Hale described it as a struggle. Brandy panicking when she realized something was wrong. Him trying to keep her quiet. The situation spiraling out of control. He insisted he didn't plan to kill her. He insisted. It just happened. But investigators had heard versions of that claim before, and they knew what it really meant. He had taken her against her will, and when she fought back, he silenced her. After she died, Hale panicked. He knew the community would search for her. He knew deputies would be knocking on doors within hours. So he carried her body to the wooded area behind his workshop. Under the cover of night, he dug a shallow grave, deep enough to conceal, but not deep enough to be permanent. When he returned home, he found her backpack in the cab of his truck. He left it near the culvert, hoping it would confuse deputies into believing she'd been taken somewhere else. But the diary was different. He knew what was inside it. He knew it contained her fear, her suspicions, and more importantly, her descriptions of him. He couldn't risk burning it or throwing it away, fearing it might somehow be traced back to him. So he hid it in the place he believed no one would ever search, under the carpet of his bedroom floor. He pushed it deep beneath the padding, sealed it with nails, and chose to believe it would remain buried there forever. When investigators asked him why he had kept it rather than destroying it, Hale simply shrugged. He said he didn't know. Maybe part of him believed he could control the truth if he kept it close. Maybe part of him believed he had gotten away with it, But when life forced him to move out years later, he never thought to return for it. He assumed it would rot away with the rest of the trailer. His confession was chilling, not because of its details, but because of the cold, quiet way he delivered it. No shaking hands, no frantic tears. Just a steady, almost emotionless recounting of how he had taken the life of a girl who trusted him with her fear. With his admission recorded and signed, investigators finally had the information they needed to search the land behind his workshop. Cadaver dogs marked an area within minutes. Beneath only a few inches of soil, they found bone fragments, clothing remnants, and jewelry that matched items Brandy had worn the day she disappeared. 16 years after her death, her remains were finally recovered and released to her family. For Patricia Moody, the moment was devastating and relieving all at once. She had spent nearly half her life living with the unanswered question of what happened to her daughter. Now she had the truth. Painful, irreversible, but real. The silence that had tormented her for so long finally gave way to something else. The certainty that her daughter had not been forgotten, and that the truth had finally reached the light. As prosecutors prepared, the case, the diary, became its emotional core. It revealed the fear Brandy had carried alone. It documented her attempts to understand the danger she felt. It outlined the pattern Hale had created long before he made contact with her. And it contained the last words she ever wrote, describing her plan to meet someone she believed could help her. In a courtroom, a diary like that wasn't just evidence. It was testimony. It was Brandy telling her story in the only way she still could. It was her voice, preserved in ink, exposing the man who had stalked her, manipulated her trust, and ended her life. Hale accepted a plea agreement that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison, though he never expressed remorse. He claimed he didn't deserve to die for what happened, and that time had punished him enough. But the community disagreed. So did Brandy's family. So did the investigators who had carried the weight of the case for nearly 2 decades. In the end, justice didn't arrive swiftly or cleanly. It arrived slowly, shaped by persistence, guilt, modern forensics, and the accidental discovery of a diary that should never have existed. It arrived because a teenage girl wrote down the truth before she disappeared, and because those words survived long enough to be found. 16 years after her final walk home, Brandy Moody's story finally reached its resolution. Not a peaceful one, not a triumphant one, but a truthful one. The kind of truth that leaves a community changed forever. And as her family laid her to rest at last, there was a quiet understanding shared among them. Brandy had found a way to speak, even when she no longer had a voice. Her diary had carried her story through time, through silence, through fear. In the end, it was her own words that revealed the man who had taken her, and it was her own words that finally brought her home.